Alrighty, so where we last left off on the OTR food and histories, the worst story in food history, sugar destroyed everything. And when we last left off on that, sugar had just finished its ascendancy to a staple and become a kind of industrialized product. I mean, as industrialized as you can get in the pre-industrial world. And of course, due to the labor-intensive production process of sugar, this led to a widespread adoption of slave labor, which is what we're about to get into, I think. So, without further ado, let's get back to this Madeira.
In the early 15th century, the Portuguese came up with a plan to break the Venetian sugar monopoly. Off the coast in the Atlantic, they discovered two uninhabited islands, so they decided to turn them both into self-contained factories, growing, processing, and exporting sugar. The first they'd call São Miguel, 760 square kilometers of lush terrain so abundant that today it's nicknamed the Green Island in the middle of the Azores. By the 1430s, waves of noblemen had arrived bringing prisoners to do the labor, but after a few failed harvests, it was clear that the climate was just a little bit too cold, so instead focus would turn to the south, to the island of Madeira. Now there, southwest of Portugal and 500 kilometers off the coast of Morocco, sugarcane would thrive, and all across Europe this was cause for relief and celebration. With a steady supply of sugar, the Portuguese could finally undercut Venetian prices, and soon enough, a new economy would take shape, with importers and distributors from Antwerp to London taking a cut of the profits. And to keep the good times rolling, well, they'd promote sugar to the general public for the very first time, and we see the beginning of the sweets and desserts that we all know today.
All right.
Anyway, with more demand
Cool to
came
see,
the
I
need
guess.
to increase production, but the Portuguese had run out of prisoners to do the actual work.
Yeah.
So they started raiding the
This is less
African
cool.
mainland, capturing a few dozen Moroccan Berbers, then a few dozen more, then thousands. The African slaves were made to dig canals to increase the size of the plantations. Before long, there were 2,100 kilometers of waterways that would turn Madeira into a sugar-growing machine. But with thousands of pots now boiling 24 hours a day, well, that required a lot of lumber. And one day, there were no more trees to cut down. Just a few decades after arriving on the island, it was ruined, and Madeira, for all intents and purposes, had been used up. Now, in recent years, as we take stock of everything that's gone wrong with our treatment of the planet, a lot of economists point to Madeira as the place where society changed. Before this colony, people would move around based on normal human factors, safety, access to food, and stuff like that. Then whatever they'd find or cultivate is what they would trade to make money. But starting with Madeira, the calculation would flip. Now people were moving to follow commodities, thinking about money first, and then working out how to survive. And that had never happened before. Now, when it comes to Madeira, from a purely financial
It sounds like we're seeing the beginnings of proto-capitalism over here.
perspective, it was a massive success. And the people who'd made the profits, well, they were ready to try again. This included Bartolomeu Perestrello, the leader of the Madeira colony.
Bro, what is this music?
And of course,
I don't hate it. Just I feel like we haven't heard this type of music within this video
son-in-law
yet.
and right-hand man, a Genoese sugar trader by the name of Christopher Columbus.
Ooh boy, him. Okay. The music makes sense now. We got Christopher Columbus stepping onto the hood. Yeah, it makes a lot more sense.
All right, now before we start this segment, I need to make one thing clear. What happened in the sugar trade during the Age of Exploration has been the subject of a ton of incredible books and comprehensive studies. Anthropologists and historians have devoted entire careers to exploring this topic, and there is no way we can tell this story here in any kind of complete way. So just keep in mind that for this next part, all we're going to be doing is going through the headlines, and the whole massive story is just so much worse than what we have time to cover. But here are the broad strokes. After Christopher Columbus accidentally bumped into the West Indies, he would come back the next year in 1493 with stalks of sugar. But it would take him another decade to find what he considered the perfect place to be his new Madeira, the island we now call Jamaica. Plans were made for a large-scale refinery, but then Columbus died and his son Diego was put in charge, and to clear the land, a few thousand indigenous Taino were marched at gunpoint to the new settlement. But this was not well thought out. The land wasn't well suited for planting, and as for the Taino, well, they had a bad habit of dying, either from overwork, Spanish diseases, or a lack of food, since the colonists also didn't take feeding the slaves into account. Anyway, where the Spanish failed, the Portuguese would succeed a few decades later and further to the south. In what's now northeast Brazil by the year 1534, we see the seeds of new enterprises, with wealthy investors bringing experts from Madeira to design entire production cities, along with sugar farms and
So
refineries.
basically
the
company
Portuguese
towns.
constructed foundries to make cast iron kettles, stonemasonries to build furnaces, carpenter shops and cooper buildings, and basically these were complete sugar colonies, which would be a template repeated over and over. And with all these new buildings, well, the Portuguese would need people, and by now there weren't a lot of natives left. So in 1542, a Portuguese planter asked the crown for permission to begin importing slaves from Africa. And the answer, of course, was yes. This would begin what would come to be called the Triangle Trade: sugar from the Americas, money from Europe, and humans from Africa. And on the cycle would grow. On the European side, demand for sugar was skyrocketing. Shops began selling cakes and pastries. Candy was
God, such a morbidly interesting idea to think that, like, all 300 years of slavery and all the racism, specifically anti-black racism that happened afterwards and during, was just because of fucking sugar and other sorts of spices and textiles, other labor-intensive products. But,
humans from Africa. And on the cycle would grow. On the European side, demand for sugar was skyrocketing. Shops began selling cakes and pastries. Candy was suddenly accessible to the masses, and products like tea, coffee, and chocolate, disregarded in the past for tasting too bitter, well, suddenly, with just a little bit of sugar, they were all new sensations. In the New World, while the Portuguese had a sugar monopoly, but only for a short time, as the Dutch quickly built their own farms in South America. Then the Dutch and Portuguese would go to war, and with the sugar supply interrupted, onto the scene came the French, the Spanish, and the English, all looking to build their own sugar empires. And with each new plantation came more African slaves. Hell, by the 1600s, all the labor had to be imported because there were no more natives. Every last Taino dead from disease, starvation, or massacre, or from work related to the sugar fields. The New World sugar plantations were brutal. Working conditions were shocking, the heat was oppressive, and the average life expectancy for any slave assigned to the industry was 8 years. That's it, 8 years. And with so much turnover, well, even more slaves would have to be sent across the Atlantic, and the numbers would be staggering. 250,000 to French Martinique, and 3 times that number to Saint Domingue, today's Haiti. 1 million Africans to the British colony of Jamaica, and 400,000 more to Barbados. The Spanish would import 800,000 to work the fields of Cuba. The Dutch would send 500,000 to Suriname, and 600,000 to Curacao, although that wasn't a sugar field. It was a slave market, auctioning off humans to plantation owners from across the South Atlantic. And as for the Portuguese, well, with full control of Brazil, they'd bring in 5.5 million Africans, completely repopulating the world's 5th largest country, with slaves trafficked from across the ocean. Altogether, during the years of the transatlantic slave trade, 12.5 million people were sent by force to the Americas. Honestly, a lot more when you consider that anyone who didn't survive the ocean crossing wasn't even counted in the numbers. And of this unbelievable total, 70%, 7 out of every 10 slaves, were sent to the New World to work in the sugar industry. And since there's no reasonable segue from this kind of subject, well, let's just take a break and go get drunk.
Honestly, yeah, I'm not gonna complain.
In the mid-1500s, pretty much as soon as the first sugar colonies show up in Brazil, the slaves began turning some of the liquid into alcohol, in the beginning fermenting the foam that the Portuguese would skim off and throw away during crystallization. The name for this waste product was cachaço. Today, cachaça is still the national drink of Brazil. Then 100 years later in Barbados, a contract was signed for a warehouse meant to store something called rum bullion. described in writing as a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. And this was how the world would be introduced to rum.
Damn. Well, one man's trash is another man's treasure, I guess.
Yeah, so this is, what are we drinking? We're drinking Captain Morgan's dark rum. Interesting thing about rum, there is no difference in the rum making process, whether it's light rum, dark rum, spiced rum. It's just clear spirit. You distill it from molasses and it's clear. The color is from aging in barrels. I don't have a microphone on you.
So wait, the color is just from aging in barrels. Is that? Wouldn't that mean you're drinking like freaking barrel material? I mean, I guess. I mean, yeah. I mean, nowadays with the preservatives and other kinds of things we put in a lot of things, I'm kind of concerning. I'm wondering what are we drinking when we're drinking rum then? If the coloring is basically barrel essence.
Cheers. When rum was first introduced, it would quickly become a part of the daily rations of British sailors. Not because they loved the stuff, but because it was said that adding alcohol to water could stave off scurvy. Before long, pretty much all of the boats sailing back and forth across the Atlantic were including rum in their provisions, the English earning the nickname limeys for adding a squeeze of citrus to their watered-down rum. Pretty much everyone was finding ways to make their rum more appealing, and it was on the boats of the Caribbean where the idea of the cocktail first shows up. According to beverage historians, the first cocktail ever was...
Okay, I was not expecting, when you said we were going to go on a quick drink break, I wasn't expecting it to be still so educational. I didn't realize so much of the I guess alcohol, modern day alcohol stuff came apparently from the goddamn transatlantic slave trade. So
something called the bumbo, made from rum, water, and sugar mixed with nutmeg and cinnamon. It would become a sensation that influenced our mainstream culture, but this was not invented by the British Royal Navy or any official merchant mariners. It was the drink of another group of people who loved their rum and who made a living by taking their own cut of the sugar trade. In the early 1600s, a group of French farmers on Hispaniola had abandoned their attempt at a sugar plantation and were living off the land, raising pigs and cattle. They built huts for smoking meat, given the Taino word boucan. In French, they'd call themselves boucaniers, or buccaneers. Now, they would have been content to stay farmers forever, but then the Spanish arrived and attacked, so the buccaneers took refuge on a small island off the northern coast, a place called Tortuga. And from there they'd take their revenge. Now, at first, the Frenchmen were only interested in making life miserable for the Spanish, but soon their exploits would earn the attention of others who sought to cause trouble for their enemies, and back then, well, everyone had enemies. So the demand for piracy soared, and more people, out-of-work farmers, runaway slaves, and even noblemen, made their way to Tortuga, and thus began the golden age of piracy. Now, back then, the Europeans used to protect their colonies by contracting ships called privateers to keep other people away. The privateers would be paid in bounty. Whenever they raided another boat, they were allowed to keep a share of the rum and gold, the rest the property of the crown. But buccaneers acknowledged no king, so by 1650, nearly all privateers were now ignoring orders and flying their own pirate flag. And with so much of the world's economy sailing in and out of their territory, well, the spoils were incredible. Sir Francis Drake was a privateer turned pirate who made so much money, he'd become a famous explorer and earn a British knighthood. Though in Spain, he's still known by the nickname the Dragon. And then there was Henry Morgan, originally from Wales. When he decided to strike out on his own, he recruited a crew from Tortuga and would steal so much gold he'd end up buying out Jamaica's sugar industry, becoming one of the richest men alive and a major celebrity in the UK. The dread...
Bro, that's crazy. I obviously I knew that like pirates were, you know, criminals basically, but I mean, rather it's because I know that pirates are criminals that's crazy to hear. They basically became so rich that they were able to, I guess they basically got fuck you money, so they didn't need to worry about paying for their crime basically, which is, I guess it's not that surprising when you think about modern day rich people, who a lot of them are basically just criminals who are too rich to be punished. No, I guess it's just that common pattern in life where a lot of things that seem modern and new are actually they're actually very ancient. Yeah.
Credit Captain Morgan. Now, the glory days of piracy would end as quickly as they'd begin, with the European countries finally agreeing in 1713 to
Yeah, I
stop
mean, there's no way that could have gone on for that long. Like, that sounds crazy.
fighting each other, turning their navies instead against the pirates of the Caribbean. But by that time, they were anti-heroes, legends described in songs and stories, and there could be no better marketing for rum. Even today, it's impossible to think of one without the other. In 1624, Dutch ships arrived in the western Pacific at a place once named Formosa by Portuguese explorers, the Island of Beauty. Since the Dutch were about to lose all their Brazilian holdings, this was their backup plan. And as soon as they landed, they started work on what would be the most ambitious sugar plantation ever conceived. Now, when the Dutch arrived, Formosa wasn't empty, but it was pretty close. The total population was somewhere around 50,000, divided into small tribes of Austronesians, the very same people whose ancestors once sailed to New Guinea and started this whole story. But the Dutch didn't care about the locals, and they weren't bringing African slaves either. No, their idea was to pay a visit to Fujian, around the old Quanzhou port, and recruit as many disaffected Chinese as possible, to try to convince the world's most venerated sugar masters to leave behind the isolationist Ming and come work for Holland. And this would be the birth of what we now call Taiwan. Now, the Taiwanese sugar colony would prove an incredible success. An estimated 35,000 Fujianese made the move.
Good lord, another. I mean, this really is bringing together a whole mess of things that were kind of, I guess, individual, unrelated entities in my mind. And I imagine a lot of people's minds. I mean, I had no idea that Taiwan was related to this whole sugar trade thing. Like, I mean, if you're in the obviously, if you're in the VTuber space at all, you're aware of how Taiwan has let's say caused some, it's been a controversial topic, but yeah, I didn't realize. I mean, I didn't realize how it started, I guess.
Moved to the island, and for the Dutch, well, their new Pacific supply of sugar would help them not just keep their European market share, but got them exclusive trading access to Japan after the shogun kicked everyone else out in 1639. After 40 years, the Dutch would lose control of Taiwan, and the island would gain a brief period of king. So by 1650, nearly all in the end, it wasn't even necessary for Europe's sugar supply. It swelled to more than 2 million, and by 1750, Taiwan was the world's leading exporter of sugar, producing 6 times as much refined product as the entire colony of Brazil. As tragic as the transatlantic slave trade was, maybe the most shocking part of the whole thing was that in the end, it wasn't even necessary for Europe's sugar supply. By the middle of the 18th century, there were enormous plantations owned by or selling to the West, not just in Taiwan, but across Southeast Asia, with equipment made in China and workers migrating from Fujian. There were massive enterprises on Luzon in the Philippines, the Indonesian island of Java, in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, and even here in Siam, where by the 1800s, 12,000 tons a year were being sold into Europe, and we're not even talking about the grandfather of sugar. But India was very much still there, and about to make its mark on our story one more time.
Yeah, I love that. The ethical
In
sugar
1781, a
revolution.
British slave ship called the
The quotes there are very, they're very comforting.
Zong was sailing across the Atlantic when the captain realized he'd miscalculated provisions and there wasn't enough drinking water to complete the trip. So he had his men execute all 130 Africans on board, then filed an insurance claim when they arrived in Jamaica.
Wow.
Now, under any other circumstances, this would not have made the news, but someone at the insurance company tipped off a freed slave and abolitionist named Olade Equiano.
I mean, yeah, I didn't respond to that much, but I don't know, it's kind of like, what do you say to that? Apparently, that was just common practice.
Who then paid a visit to Granville Sharp, an allied lawyer, and from there, well, this was just the kind of sensation that they knew might start an anti-slavery movement, and that's exactly what happened. The Quakers came on board almost immediately. Then the
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing with these stories, I guess. Not stories, with slavery, I guess. You know, there were always people who were who were abolitionists, I should say, always anti-slavery. Which, I mean, I guess, like, might sound like it goes without saying, but there are plenty of people who would insist otherwise. Like, I guess, yeah.
Industrialist Josiah Wedgwood, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who went as far as to design a logo. Poets and writers made sure the newspaper stayed engaged, and the public couldn't get enough of the sordid details. And then finally, in 1791, 500,000 British citizens went on strike.
What on earth, bro? The artist was a the artist who ever drew this person's face was kind of
against New World Sugar, the first
let's say, you know, they use in practice
ever in history, and it would prove effective. Nearly overnight, all major shops and vendors switched to carry.
I mean, to be fair, it sounds like these are not supposed to be flattering pictures, so I guess it makes sense they look butt fucking ugly.
Quote, ethical sugar from British India. Signs outside bakeries and candy stores advertised sugar from the East Indies, not the West Indies, and shipments sent from India started carrying the slogan, free grown or made by free people.
It really is crazy. Like, it really is crazy how this is literally just like the modern day, basically, but like 300 years ago. I mean, again, I've been saying it. It's not uncommon for that to be the case. But I mean, just when you see it with your own eyes, it's like
the details
something
of the
else.
Zong massacre and the book that Equiano would publish would finally turn public sentiment against slavery across the continent. And just 1 year after the sugar boycott, Denmark would become the first European country to ban the transatlantic slave trade, and from there, well, the ball would slowly start rolling. Now, the legacy of the free-grown sugar movement is complicated. On one hand, the public pressure to outlaw slavery was huge, and it would be a major turning point. But by focusing only on the slave trade, the public ignored the environmental catastrophe that was unfolding, not just in the New World, but in Taiwan, Indonesia, and beyond, where entire jungles were being cut down to keep up with demand. There was no discussion about the brutal nature of sugarcane work in the first place, paid or unpaid, as even where there was no slavery, sugar plantations still had the highest mortality of any industry. As a matter of fact, with quotas increasing by the 1800s, the average life expectancy on a sugar field had actually gone down from 8 to 7 years, slave or otherwise. And of course, there was the fact that sugar from India wasn't exactly a utopian product itself. The workers on English colonial plantations in a lot of cases didn't have any more choice than African slaves. Their hours were just as brutal, payment was next to nothing, and the sugar was hardly the conscientious product that consumers seemed to believe. But maybe we just didn't want to know, since the one thing never discussed at all was just giving up sugar.
Right.
Even though it had only been a part of our diet for 200 years.
I mean, at that point, it sounds like it's freaking the gasoline of the 1700s. Like, they're not going to give that up any more than we would give up our gasoline.
By this point, we were hooked, and there was no going back. One last note, by the way, in 1838, when England would finally abolish slavery in the colonies, the new Queen Victoria would agree to a system of compensation to make up for the change in policy. The Crown agreed to pay a sum to anyone invested in the sugar trade to help smooth over the loss of free human labor, and the payouts were so high that it would bring about what we now call the Victorian era. It would be the largest stimulus in history relative to the size of an economy, and it would kickstart the Industrial Revolution and bring about a new British Golden Age. As for the slaves themselves,
Really?
well, they got
That's.
nothing.
You're not. I don't disbelieve what you're saying. I'm more just surprised. Apparently, I guess it makes sense. I mean, the way people normally talk about with it being kind of a, I guess, quote unquote, natural result of the, I guess, invention of the steam engine and like coal mining and whatnot. Yeah, I can believe that wasn't the whole story. I mean, definitely getting what is apparently the largest cash infusion in any economy's history. I mean, yeah, it sounds like it would like jumpstart a whole bunch of shit.
Let's take another rum break.
Oh, good. We'll learn some more about crazy connections between alcohol and sugar and modern day things.
You know, it's funny because we're sitting here at a cocktail bar, and like, what is a cocktail, right? You know, this was my job forever. I was behind a bar, you know, making cocktails, and a cocktail is something strong like a liquor, something sour or bitter, and then something sweet to bring it into balance. And you know, that sweetness, you know, I can't imagine, like, what is the base cocktail? The base cocktail is a daiquiri. It's rum, it's lime or citrus, and it's sugar. You know, what's an old fashioned? What's a Manhattan? You go through these cocktails, there's always that sweet element that has to balance out the rest of it. And like, it's the same thing when we talk about what are the basic flavor profiles of food. Sweet, sour, spicy, salty,
Yeah.
bitter, umami, right? Like, that sweetness is new. This is not something that's always existed. You know, the last video we made before this, we were taping in Lake Toba in Indonesia, and that's a place where the cuisine is 3,000 years old. You know, Dennis, you remember we were just down there. There was no sugar. They don't use it. It does not exist in their cuisine. And like, it's interesting when you think about our basic idea of what something tastes like, a drink or food.
Yeah.
It incorporates.
It's always interesting to find out that so many of the things we take to be sort of fundamental, like parts of civilization are actually often very modern, new things. You know, things that did not exist for most of human history, or if they did exist, they were not commonplace or like everyday sort of things.
Incorporates this flavor, which is brand new, which we didn't have. You know, we couldn't afford. We didn't know about it, and we had fruits, we had honey, but we weren't. A meal was not something that had to involve, you know, a sweet element. This is something that kind of, you know, it's only been a few generations like this, but we can't even imagine what food or drinks would be like without it. Take sugar out of cocktails and there are no more cocktails. It's just not a thing that exists.
How easy we forget. How easy we get used to things.
And that's the end of the bottle, and that means that it's time for us to wrap up here.
Yeah. Let's see more man-made horrors within our comprehension.
A decade after the British sugar boycott, the European continent would be almost completely cut off from New World sugar. Not by choice, but because of a series of blockades thanks to the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1811, Napoleon himself was visited by a delegation of French scientists who told the emperor about a new innovation, one that might enable him to supply his country with sugar made at home with no need to import anything. The basic concept involved the use of a plant that had been found to store sucrose after photosynthesis, just like the sugarcane stalk. It was called the beta vulgaris, basically the common beet. And while in nature its sugar content was barely 1%, well, for more than half a century, experiments in Germany had quietly managed to increase this to 5%, then 10, then 20, exactly on par with the sugarcane.
Creating
The idea to
mutant
cultivate
sugar, mutant
beets came from
beets.
Frederick the Great, who as a northern king surrounded by enemies was obsessed with food independence. It's also why he's known as the father of potato farming. Anyway, to run the experiments, he'd hire Andreas Marggraf, a Berlin professor of physics, who would
Why the
successfully
hell does he look like a ancient Roman, like Senate person?
crystallize white sugar from beets. And then Marggraf's student Franz Karl Achard would perfect the process and open the first small-scale factory in Poland, which was all the proof that Napoleon needed to see. He'd go all in, ordering 70,000 acres to be planted with sugar beets. And not only did France suddenly find itself with a domestic source of sugar, well, the world had a humane alternative, at least relatively speaking. After all, processing beets didn't involve tropical heat, razor-sharp leaves, or the threat of imminent spoilage. They were just beets. Boil them and...
I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop and for it to turn out to, like, yeah, actually, it's just a different type of inhumane.
There you go. By 1840, 5% of the world's sugar market had moved from cane to beets, and within 4 more decades, that number was up to half, 50%. And that changed the balance of power, as now it was the beet producers who got to set global prices, and they did through collusion and stock manipulation. As a matter of fact, in the 20th century, the oil cartels would base their structure and models on the tactics of big sugar. And these conglomerates, well, pretty soon they were in the food business as well. Sweet cookies and desserts, breakfast cereals, sodas.
What? So I'm hearing that all of these shitty, like, advertising and corporate practices that have basically hollowed out society for, like, the past 100 some odd years were pioneered by like, beet sugar companies. I mean, it really does sound like sugar. Yeah, I mean, the title of this video, how sugar destroyed everything, it gets more and more true the longer this video goes on.
And in just 50 years, the average sugar consumption in the United States alone went from 8 kilos per person in 1850 to 41 in 1900. And most of that increase was based on children who would spend their allowance at the neighborhood candy store. And then as ad agencies started shaping consumer tastes, well, sugar gives us another breakthrough. Brands like Tootsie Rolls becoming the first products marketed directly to kids. And as if that wasn't enough, there would be one more use for beet sugar that would make an impact on the 20th century. And since this story is already f***ing terrible, well, why not bring in Adolf Hitler just for good measure?
Yeah, right.
See, the Nazis were massive sugar beet producers, in part because they'd been cut off from foreign imports, but also because Hitler himself was so addicted to sweets. He was said to eat 2 pounds of candy every day.
2 pounds.
Spoons of sugar to his tea and his wine
Bro,
and his water.
Do I even need 2 pounds of anything in a day?
Teeth had already started falling out because of all the sweets. But his main interest in sugar was the fact that a byproduct of crystallizing beets is something known as prussic acid, or as it's more commonly referred to, hydrogen cyanide. The cyanide made by the Nazis from beet sugar wastewater would be given the name Zyklon B, and it was this gas that would be used at concentration camps. And I'm just going to grab a bottle of rum one more time.
Yeah.
Just give me a second.
I was not expecting that.
In 1954, members of a lobbying group called the SRF, or Sugar Research Foundation, were concerned about press coverage blaming sugar for a surge in obesity, heart disease, and cancer. So they came up with a plan to pay off.
I brought this up way back at the beginning of part 1 of this video. I did not expect there to be so much worse, so much more behind sugar.
off dozens of scientists, including Harvard professors, to start planting articles in medical journals blaming all the bad stuff on fat, not sugar. Suddenly, our grocery stores were full of low-fat products and fat-free whatever, and all it meant was more and more sugar packed into our food. And our consumption would rise by another 30% in the aftermath of the SRF studies. And the more sugar we eat, the more we destroy not just our health, but our planet. As by now, out of all the land we have, well, 8% of every square centimeter of land on Earth, well, it's used to farm sugarcane. Another 2% for sugar beets, and it gets even worse. With monoculture farming comes the risk of pests and disease. So that means more use of pesticides, and that means we need to modify the food itself so it can handle getting sprayed with all those chemicals. And if that sounds over the top, well, 95% of all the sugar beets grown in the US today are from a species called Roundup Ready, genetically engineered by Monsanto to be resistant to the cancer-causing pesticide Roundup, which is also owned by Monsanto. And if that's not evil enough, well, in 2018, Monsanto was sold to Bayer, a healthcare company. So now the same conglomerate that tells you what's safe to eat is making your food, making the pesticides in your food, and making the medicine you're gonna need when your food starts to kill you. And I'm not taking
Sounds like
Bayer.
a perfect cycle of capitalist greed right there.
That's everything. Pretty much every major food product is now a part of this cycle designed to keep you eating sugar. And we could keep going about all the health crises and environmental crises we're all facing because of our sugar addiction. We could talk about all the human trafficking that's still going on in the false advertising of the, quote, fake sugar industry. But it has been a long day, so I'm just gonna pour myself one more shot, maybe put on some happy music, grab a snack to feel better, anything to wrap up the worst story in the history of food, the story of sugar.
Fucking wild.
Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you soon.
I want to see some of the... Oh, definitely going to like this video, but I want to see some of the comments. Yeah, again, people are being funny here. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you for not sugarcoating the subject. I'll see myself out, yeah. Sugar, the biggest drug trade the world's ever known. I mean, yeah, this is often a sentiment you hear in videos like this. Like, dude, I think this video should be part of a global education curriculum. Just wow. But it's like, I mean, you hear some of the stuff we're talking about in this video. Like, there's no way the sugar companies would allow a shit like this to be, you know, commonly taught and commonly taught at all. Like, yeah, just crazy. Trying to resize this. Wait. There. Good lord, it took forever to get the little toolbar thingy up there. Anyway, I mean, there's so much to be said about this. But I mean, one thing that sticks out to me at the core of this story is kind of like this idea of turning this thing has become very prevalent in modern society, of taking what in pre-modern society and in the ancient past, whatever, was just kind of a special treat, or like you know, something that was not an everyday like commodity, whatever. Taking that and turning it into something, you know, mass produced and all that stuff, and the cost of doing that, like, I guess, like, there's almost like a narrative kind of lesson to it, where it's like, you know, it was special for a reason. You know, like, you can't There's some things in the world that you shouldn't make, every day kind of idea. I don't know, it's like I guess as we get older, we tend to think of those sorts of fairy tale style lessons is that's for kids. It's not relevant to us adults in our adult world, whatever. But I mean, having seen what happens when you try to go against that, maybe there's a reason that we tell those stories to our children. Yeah, then. I mean, I wrote here the beginnings of African slavery and sugarcane production process. But I mean, apparently, it was the sugarcane production process was the beginning of like 80% of our modern way of life. So there's not really a reason to specifically single out African slavery and all the horrors that resulted from that. It's like just shaking my damn head. Yeah. And I also noticed the similarities between sugar production and gasoline production. Similar just awful impact on the peoples and lands where gasoline and other sorts of natural gas and petroleum products are sourced and produced. I mean, the Middle East is very. I was reminded very much of the Middle East when I was hearing some of these stories about what was going on in like South America and just the Americas in general. Yeah, I mean, the last little, I guess, nugget is something kind of specific to world builders such as myself. I mean, this little insight that very specific arbitrary things can very easily become fundamental aspects of society that self-perpetuate themselves in perpetuity. Like something that was something like sugar that was originally not really a part of most societies' diets, not in any clear, explicit way, can suddenly become these it's almost like a cancer metastasizing in a host body. But I mean, they can become these things that just hijack the whole of society and force it to keep producing itself, even at the complete detriment of society. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Like, it doesn't. To be fair, the way I'm describing it sounds like it always has to be a negative thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, I can't really think of any non-native examples off the top of my head, but it's an interesting thing for me to keep in mind going forward. But just amazing video all around. You can definitely look at more of this guy's stuff. We got a whole. Hopefully, the history of other things is not going to be as terrible. Though I do know the potato has had some interesting, let's call it interesting effects in terms of famine and other such things. But yeah. Thanks so much for watching. Consider liking, commenting, maybe even subscribing. And if you're feeling particularly generous and of age in your country of residence, try visiting these links up in the corner. Anyway, here are some more videos to check out, and until next time, take care.